Okay, yes, fabulous. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. My name is Kristine Palmieri, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago. So the pithy answer is completely by accident. But to be more serious, I originally thought that I was going to write my dissertation on the history of the human sciences in 19th century Germany with a focus on classical philology. But as I started doing my research, I realized that I couldn't answer the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask about human knowledge and about knowledge of humanity without going into the 18th century. So I changed my research focus, and here we are. So my personal understanding is actually really conflicted. I personally tend to use the Enlightenment as a synonym for the 18th century or for the long 18th century as a way of denoting a discrete temporal period. Now, of course, I use the term heuristically, but as a historian, my goal is always to understand the term the way my actors understood the term, and not to impose my own understanding upon them or upon my sources. And this is where kind of my conflict comes in, because there is a very, very ideologically loaded way of talking about Enlightenment and about the Enlightenment. And so, especially as someone working at an American institution, I see this especially in pernicious narratives about political, philosophical, or scientific progress, which in turn comes to undergird the kinds of white nationalism, misogyny, and racism that we see in the United States so prevalently today. So to give just one example, the men and women who overturned Roe v. Wade said that they were doing what the founding fathers would have wanted. But if that's not a bastardization of history, and especially of the history of the Enlightenment, then I'm afraid I don't know what is. So that's really just an intentionally provocative way of saying that my understanding of Enlightenment is first and foremost historical. Yes, that's a fabulous and a deeply important question. The Enlightenment absolutely continues to be relevant both for and in the present. And in particular, I believe this is because historically, when we have narratives about the so-called birth of the modern world, it's either located in the Enlightenment or identified as an immediate consequence of the Enlightenment. And so I think this gives us scholars who work on this period and this topic such an amazingly powerful way to intervene in modern conversations about pressing issues. My hope would be that in so doing, we can not only challenge these sorts of oversimplistic accounts of things like modernity and progress, but that we can also undermine and frankly eviscerate these really noxious narratives that I think quite rightly have thrown the entire concept of Enlightenment into, or at least Enlightenment when studied or used in a way that is both normative and teleological, right, into disrepute. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I think there are so many opportunities, but there's one point at which the opportunities and the difficulties kind of coincide with one another in ways that I think are both productive and, potentially troublesome. And that's in this difference between the Enlightenment singular versus Enlightenments plural. So personally, I'm a little allergic to using the Enlightenment as a singular. And I choose always to talk about Enlightenments in the plural. Now, I don't think, fortunately for me, this is really common and it's not a novel viewpoint. And indeed, I think amongst the people that I work, it would be really unusual to see someone talking about the Enlightenment in the singular. But I think that especially based upon the distinction between popular narratives and academic narratives, we always need to be really careful about how we're using these terms and what we're trying to do with them. So I see a lot of opportunity and a lot of problems in, yes, this Enlightenment versus Enlightenments distinction. For me, there are two main questions that I think we really need to think through as a field. The first concerns temporality. So simply put, what do we do with the 18th century? And by this I mean, where do we put people who work on the 18th century? Do we put them with the modernists or do we put them with the early modernists? Personally, I would love to say that they belong to both and to neither because of the wonderfully Janus-faced nature of the 18th century. Because we can look both forwards and backwards. And I think that the best scholarship focused on the Enlightenment does both. So I'm reluctant to draw any sort of line, but at the same time, especially in history, it's really important to think about who you're talking to. And so, yeah, what to do with the 18th century is a question that keeps me up at night. And the other one, I think, it really comes down to what I see as the fundamentally Eurocentric, or at least Western-centric nature of the Enlightenment, or even of Enlightenments. So I would like to see what happens if we think really seriously about writing something like a global history of Western Enlightenments, as opposed to a global history of Enlightenment, where in the latter case, the absence of the definite article not only elevates Enlightenment to a more abstract concept, but that also frees it from any sort of temporal boundaries or kind of chronological obligations.